All right. Well, welcome everyone to the last couple hours of Shabbat, the last couple hours of Passover, and hopefully not quite so long as in a couple hours of Stump the Stars Jewish Style. And before we get underway,
Right before beer and pizza.
yes, that's right. Since several of the people who are on with us were not here for that, would you like to explain that before we pray?
Well, this is the last day of Passover. So tonight, after sundown, you are permitted to go back to pre-Passover food choices. And so just a straw poll, I sometimes take, I ask people, what do you want to have? And the most common answer is beer and pizza. I don't care for beer, so I won't be having any. So you may enjoy my portion of beer, but I'll enjoy the pizza. One memorable person said she wanted a steak sandwich, like a Philadelphia steak sandwich. And then last night we had another person chime in and said they craved pasta. So I said, pasta would also be good, and I would enjoy that meal too, but it's sort of become traditional, at least for the people we hang around. I don't know. Your mileage may vary.
All of which to say, enjoy your beer and pizza or whatever else you will eat once the sun sets and Passover has left us behind for another year, along with the special diet that we have during the night.
And we're very thankful that we only have just a partial box of matzah left, because that's another win if you have judged the right amount of matzah for your house. Because he had to go out and get some on Wednesday because we were running out. Did you notice? So during my lifetime, boxes of matzah used to have 15 pieces in them. Now guess how many they have? Not 12. No, that would be sort of good. 9. I'm telling you, this is not cool. It's not cool. Because 15 is harder to eat up and you have to buy less. It's okay. We have not wasted money on matzah. I'm good.
All right. Since you have the floor, would you start us in prayer?
Oh, could I? Yeah, that'd be great. Avinu Malchinu, our Father and our King, we thank you that we've been able to meet here tonight. We thank you that you have brought us this far. And we look forward to listening to you tonight, and we look forward to learning things and also to apply things so that when we walk forward, we might walk together with you, hand in hand. Yeshua Meshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Okay. Since we normally do it this way, I'm going to do it this way again. Those of you who are in front of us, do you have any questions that we should start with? If some occur during the course of the evening, make sure you let us know. Next, those of you who are on the monitor that we can see, do you have any questions? All right.
They're so confused. They don't even know that they're like the kid in the Seder.
They got blown away by beer and pizza.
The kid who doesn't have any capacity to it. Yeah, in the Seders.
I have a really simple question. Very simple, except that I didn't have a really good answer for it. My 10-year-old grandson, I did a resurrection play for my grandchildren and had them act out Yeshua's life and death and resurrection. And Garrett said, well, why did people hate Yeshua? And I'm like, ooh, that's a good question.
Okay, now,
this is a 10-year-old we're answering.
A 10-year-old we're answering. Now, was the question, why did they hate him in his day, or why do they hate them by his day, in Yeshua's day, or why do they hate him in your grandson's day? Which was
in Yeshua's day.
Okay,
Remember, it's right after Good Friday.
yep.
So many things have been yada, yada, yada.
Okay, first the commercial. Some of that stuff is dealt with in, I knew there was another preposition here. Some of that stuff is dealt with in our book, The Distortion, which we wrote a number of years ago. So if you don't have that, then you need to pick it up. Now, the commercial's over. A brief answer. That's a very significant question. And in fact, the wrong understanding of those events and the people's responses has laid the groundwork for what we might call underlying or inadvertent anti-Semitism. Usually what comes next is, it's not why did they hate him? It's why did the Jewish people hate him? Or why did they reject him? Or why did they kill him? Any one of those variations becomes somewhat problematic. All right, the story in brief. Story in brief begins with the week before the resurrection, with Palm Sunday, when Yeshua comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. And as he comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, he is greeted by crowds of people. And those crowds of people are there in Jerusalem at Passover time. Which raises the question, who would those crowds of people be in Jerusalem at Passover time? Jewish people. And what did this crowd of Jewish people do when he came riding in? Well, they did several things. First, they laid down the palm branches. That was an Oriental way of welcoming a great dignitary or a king. So by their actions, they were showing that they were welcoming him as a king or a great dignitary. Then that's what they did. And then what did they say? Well, first thing they said was, the English is Hosanna, Hoshana in Hebrew, which is often misunderstood as an expression of praise. It's not. It means save us now. It's a request. It's not an expression of praise. So they're asking the one whom they are greeting as a king to save us now. Save us from what? Or from whom? Well, Roman oppression, among other things, from the situation they were going through. But the striking thing about that is there's a series of prayers that are called Hoshanot that are an important part of Sukkot. And the Hoshanot that are part of Sukkot, the Festival of Tabernacles, those are addressed to the one who's called the branch of David. Well, who's the branch of David? The branch of David is a title for the Messiah. So they are addressing these prayers with a reflection of the Messianic prayers from Sukkot to this one that they are greeting. So they are recognizing him as Messiah. And if that wasn't significant enough, they addressed these prayers to the one whom they call Son of David. Son of David was the most common Messianic title of that time period. So they're addressing Messianic prayers to the one whom they're calling the Messiah. And then finally they greet him. Baruch haba b'Shem Adonai, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. The rabbis of old used to teach people that if you ever had the opportunity to greet the Messiah, here's how you greet the Messiah. Baruch haba b'Shem Adonai. So, in a number of distinct ways, this crowd of Jews not only greeted him as Messiah, but welcomed him and received him as a Messiah. They did not reject him. They did not.
They loved him.
They loved him.
Everything they said was about love, accept, love, accept.
Yep. And in fact, the response was so great that it caused the members of the Sanhedrin, the high priest and his allies, to do two things. One, to try to take him because he posed a threat, but two, they realized they could not do that publicly or by daylight because, as they said, because they were afraid of the crowds. The crowds of whom? The crowds of Jewish people. So that Palm Sunday scene, and there's much more stuff besides that. I think in light of your grandson's question, take him back to earlier in the week, go through the Palm Sunday scene, and here's what the Palm Sunday scene says. Or as the gospel said on a couple occasions earlier, the crowds listened to him gladly. And on one occasion, even earlier, they tried to make him king. So that's the response of the Jewish people at the time.
Thank you. That he has no clue about Judaism or any kind of anti-Semitism. And I went real simple. I said, well, Yeshua is God, and some people hate God.
Well, in this case, as Yeshua said elsewhere, when he gets to Jerusalem, find this both in Matthew and Luke, he will be turned over to the Gentiles or to the Romans who will kill him. So he assigns responsibility there. The other biblical texts do the same thing.
I think also that if he goes to, it could be a good church, it could have a great Sunday school, he could have a good Sunday school. Oh, he doesn't. So somebody told him that Yeshua died because people hated him. Is that where you think this came from?
Probably so, because I think he was struggling with understanding why they would crucify him. When I get to go over there, that's about the only time he gets any kind of instruction. Although by the time he finished first grade, he had read the entire Bible, the children's Bible. So he loves the word and he gets part of it, but he couldn't understand why in the world these people would crucify somebody so good.
Well, because he threatened the power structure of that day. Remember, all the areas of power are all set up, and he threatened them. And so he was dangerous. What he was saying had to be gotten rid of so that no one else could hear him, because if he continued, the argument was he'll bring the whole nation down. Rome will come in and take the temple away and shut everything down, which is actually what they did do not very long after that. So there's that fine line between the people loved him, but the people in power, who are a different group, were threatened by what he was saying, and were threatened by the amount of adoration that the people who followed him had. Yeah. Is that fair enough?
That's perfect. And in fact, what Patrice referred to was the statement that occurs at least a couple times in the Gospel of John, where the high priest and his allies, high priest speaking to his allies, said, better than one person die than the whole nation get destroyed. While Patrice was talking, I was looking up the address for the verse that came to mind. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8 says, none of the rulers of this age understood it, talking about the message of God through Yeshua. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So who crucified him? The rulers of this age. The Jewish people were not rulers of this age. The rulers of that age were the Romans and their cohorts. And it says they're the ones who crucified the Lord of glory.
There's one line of thought that pops up regularly during Palm Sunday, or if you happen to go to church on Maundy, Thursday, or on Good Friday services. This one line that seems to pop its head up every year, where the person who's speaking says something like, the crowds that loved him on Sunday, on Friday, wanted to kill him. Have you heard it? That is so false and slanderous. It should be called out every time we hear it. That is wrong. Dead wrong. Why do we say that, dear?
Well,
That it's dead wrong? All right. Who showed up at the pilot's judgment seat? Let's say on Friday morning, we're not going to argue calendar right now. We're just going to do Friday morning. Who showed up? Who was the crowd there on Friday morning compared to the crowd on Sunday? Same people?
The
Oh, yeah.
Sanhedrin.
Yes. And it also says some were paid to come. And the question I keep telling people, how many people were there on Friday morning to hear Pilate have a conversation with Yeshua? This is where
Maybe
it goes
100.
all wrong. In the movies, name a movie that talks about the last week of Yeshua's life. Name one. They all get it wrong. They have thousands of people there watching this. Thousands. And when you actually go there in Jerusalem and you go down underneath a convent that's built on the top, on ground level, you go down to the Roman era level, which is about a story down, you'll see how big Pilate's judgment area is. And if you really, really pack people into this area, you could get maybe 100 people there. Not thousands. Probably not even 100. Some are from the Sanhedrin, for sure. And some are also paid to give false testimony, aren't they? It says so. Which gospel
all
was
the
it?
Gospels say that.
All the gospels say. So it's that crowd that said, crucify him, not the Sunday crowds. What were the Sunday crowds doing? Well, Passover was going to start. They were getting everything ready. It was a major, major holiday. There was special preparation because of the whole leavening problem. It says it was early in the morning. So they were at home getting ready. Plus, add to your mental picture, visitors. Hundreds, could be 100,000 visitors. And if you had family coming into town to stay with you because you lived in Jerusalem, you're taking care of your visitors. You're not going over to Pilate's judgment seat because you don't know about it. You are busy. You're busy. So the crowd that was on Sunday probably did not show up for that Friday morning trial scene. And it was, I would think that the enemy had control over how that was carried out to begin with. He was there, and it doesn't say that any of his friends were there with him even. Does it say point blank that any of the disciples were there with him?
In that scene, probably not.
I don't think they make an appearance. Remember, he's been under guard all night, or from when they captured him in Gethsemane. Some scholars say that he had been put in a holding cell at Caiaphas's place. Where Caiaphas's estate was supposed to be, there are many cisterns in the ground, and broken cisterns that were used as holding cells. So he was by himself. There was nobody hanging out with him, for good or for ill. Mainly because when you're in a cistern and you're in holding, nobody can be there with you. And we have no indication that his disciples were. I'm checking with you.
Not that I can recall.
Mr. Gospels guy.
Not on that scene.
Not in that scene. So, yeah, it's tragic, but it's not the same crowd. In fact, you could truly say it's not a crowd. It was a group. with a trumped-up trial. So that's my lecture. But it bothers me tremendously when you have church leaders saying these things that are untrue and provably untrue. That really bothers me because it gives people the wrong idea about how and why Yeshua died. It gives them the totally wrong idea. Is that fair enough to say? Because if when we talk about Yeshua's trial and death, we do not consider ourselves there, if we're pointing the finger and said, they do it, then you're not pointing, you must point to yourself first. He died because I won. If I would have been there, I would have said it too. Not they did that wrong and we would never do that wrong. They're the ones who are wrong. No, we're all wrong equally. Is that fair enough? You're frowning at me.
I was thinking more in terms of it's because of us
Yeah.
that it took place.
It's because
Yeah.
of us.
Did you finish?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. I've heard the numbers for the population of Jerusalem during festival season and so during Passover time to be pretty close to 250,000. So you're talking about less than 100 people out of 250,000 who said crucify him. Now back to the crowds, there's one other scene, and that is Luke 23 as he's being led off to be executed. The crowds are there once again as they line the streets of Jerusalem, and Luke tells us that they cried,
They wept
they mourned.
because it was already a done deal. There was nothing they could do to intervene. But the crowds lined his route and wept for him.
Yeah.
Which is a mirror scene of someone else famous that they would have known about who had the same kind of scenario. He's leaving Jerusalem and the crowds are lining the streets, saying goodbye and weeping. That would be King David. And if you don't know that story, probably you need to read 2 Samuel, because that did happen to King David. And so Luke, who writes about this in great detail, knows about King David better than you and I. And he matched up the scenario so that everybody else could see this is what happened to King David.
So to come full circle on the question that Patrice raised, where were the crowds, the crowds from Sunday, where were they, as she said, as often perceived, where were they on Friday? Well, Luke tells us, not in the group of several dozen people in front of Pilate, but they were the same crowds that lined the streets of Jerusalem as he was being led off. And they wept because of what they saw was happening to the one whom they had received.
Yeah.
So that's more of the story. I'm trying to think of it. Since we haven't really dealt with this, I'm just thinking if there's anything more we need to sort of put a period on the story for this so it's not incomplete.
Well, I wanted to mention that our friend, Dr. Thomas Troublehorn, he is currently in the middle of writing a book on Yeshua's last week. And we know where he's at because he hired our daughter to do the editorial part of it. So she keeps us abreast on what's going on. So it's very close to publication. And I think it's going to be very helpful for people to read it in more of a scholarly way than they normally hear at a sermon or a Bible study.
Or, as the commercials are coming, let me add to that, both in the Jewish Roots and Foundations of Scripture Part 1 course, as well as in the Part 2 course, we do cover the last week of Yeshua's life in quite a bit of detail. So if you want to get that, or You can either, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
And
those are acceptable.
and our book called the short book called The Distortion,
Yeah.
which we were requested to write when the Mel Gibson movie came out. We were requested to write this about the anti-Semitic ideas that were perpetrated in that film. And so that would also have information about what is true and what is false in that film, which once again had to do with the last week of Yeshua's life. There's a lot of things that happened during that last week, and sometimes it just gets, boiled down to one or two important things.
Yeah, and in the two sections of the course, the two parts of the course I mentioned, we actually do a handout. So you have a graphic in front of you so you can see what's going on each day of the week. And since I know what we need to do to sort of finish this part of the discussion. And that is, although most people think it happened on Friday, drum roll please, he died on Wednesday. So other than that, then we've sort of completed our part of the story for now in short form. So good question, very timely question. And thank you, Barbara. There was a question that was sent in to us this week. We are hanging on to one that was sent in to us a couple of weeks ago. But since this one was sent in most recently this week, and it's relatively short, the question is very short. The answer, not so much so. The question was, why do you touch your seat to the Torah scroll when you are in its vicinity? Or to expand it just a little more briefly, the tradition is you touch your seat to it, or you touch the siddur to it. You don't touch it with your hands. Why don't you touch it with your hands?
You want to show them what your tzitzit are? I think they can see them. Just put them up on the table.
I forgot to put them on this morning.
Okay.
Oops.
I don't even know if he's going to be kosher to give this whole talk, but that's okay. Scott has his.
Okay.
There we are.
There
Oh,
we
yeah,
go.
very nice.
Way to show me up, Scott.
Yeah,
Way to
that's
show
good.
me up.
That's good.
All right.
You feel so comfortable that you just forgot.
Got rushed. I was rushing to get dressed. I was going to say this morning. It wasn't this morning. It was this afternoon. And it seems.
We don't get dressed when we wake up in the morning. Anybody else? No, but
But
just
the
you.
tzitzit were there yesterday.
Okay.
But anyhow.
Normally they're there. That's why I assumed.
So back to the tzitzit. So either the tzitzit or the siddur, not the hand. Is it because we all have unholy hands or ungodly hands? No, it's because we have dirty hands. Yes, they are because we have dirty hands, but not in the theological sense. It's that,
Well, in the sense they would be unclean
In-
in theological sense.
yes. It's, and that's the same reason why you don't, when you're reading from the scroll, you don't use your hand to follow. You use the
Yad. It's called the yad.
well, I was going to describe it as
It's a pointer.
it's a
It's a pointer.
image of a hand.
It's a pointer.
It's a mini hand.
About this long, and it has a finger on the end that's literally going like.
So that's the only hand that touches it.
But you don't even touch the scroll with that mini pointer either.
And you don't do it with your hands because you don't want to get the oil or the dirt from your hands on the scroll. And that because all scrolls are made of papyrus. They're not made
No.
of paper.
No, vellum.
Vellum, sorry.
Vellum. They are not made
I'm
of,
sorry, not papyrus, vellum. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
which is kosher
skin.
animal skins, not paper papyrus.
No. Yes, they're made of animal skins and that can degrade with too much of hand oils and stuff like that.
Well, the ink is what you
Yeah.
are trying to save the ink.
Yeah.
Because the ink can scratch off if it's roughly handled.
So there's the pointer, there's the yad, which is the mini hand. why do we even touch it? It wouldn't be a problem if we didn't touch it. We do so for two reasons. We do so as a sign of respect, of reverence, of understanding just exactly what this represents. It isn't what it contains. It contains the very words of God. But most people understand, no, I won't say most people who teach about it understand that and teach it in that way. But there's one other thing that's also included here that's very important. It's not just a sign or a reflection of respect. It is a sign and a reflection of response. And the inherent response is, this is something that I'm going to hear, let it absorb into my life, and then put it into action. I will respond based on what I hear. So it's a sign of respect, and it's a sign of a response saying, I will respond to what I'm hearing. It is all part of and we talked about this a number of weeks ago in an entirely different setting, but not totally different setting, because in some cases I was reminded of the Mel Gibson movie because of it. Optics. We do it because of optics. So what are the optics that are involved? Well, to take a step back, the traditional Shabbat service is meant to be a worship drama that we enter into, that we participate in. It is meant to enable us in some way to enter the drama that has unfolded as part of our history in two parts. One, when we first received the Torah, and two, when our people went up to the temple to worship. So it is a sacred drama that takes place every Shabbat that we get to experience as we encounter the God who was resident within the temple, as we encounter the God who actually gave us the Torah. The parts that reflect the giving of the Torah, of course, are when we stand and we say, the Zohar Torah. These are the words that God has given us through the hand of Moses. Those words come virtually from Exodus 19 and 20, where the people said, or maybe it was also 24 now that I'm thinking of it, all that the Lord has said we will do. That is effectively what the Zohar Torah is saying in a literary fashion as it's reflecting those words. So, our people stood in the presence of God to receive the Torah. In the synagogue, we stand in the presence of God to receive the Torah. So we are reenacting that Mount Sinai experience of receiving the Torah. The other part of the sacred drama that takes place every Shabbat is it's as if we get to enter into the temple grounds and the temple itself, like our people did in days of old when they went up to Jerusalem to worship God in his temple. And so the various parts of the service are designed to reflect that, both in a fuller and longer Torah service. You get the parts of the service that reflect the people as they are actually walking up the temple stair, or the stairs into the temple courtyard, in the Psalms that are part of that. You get responses that are part of reflecting the experience as if we are now going into the temple courtyard. There are parts that are reflecting the experience that we are, as if, once again, offering sacrifices, although as often is mentioned in the liturgy, there are sacrifices of praise. And then there are times when we actually, as it were, stand in the presence of God. On many arks, as there is in ours, over the ark, there's, I just lost the words.
Know before whom you are standing.
Yes,
Like, be aware of before whom you are standing right now. That's the sign. That's a Talmudic verse, I think.
it could very well be. So as you stand before the ark, it says, know before whom you are standing. And we're standing there in God's presence. And when we return the scroll to the ark, what do we say? We think, oh, Yomar. It's as if we are standing as God's priests in his presence. It says, clothe your priests with righteousness. So the whole sacred drama of which the Torah scroll is part involves two striking events. The drama of entering into the temple in the days when the temple stood, and the drama of standing before the God of the universe as that mountain literally shook and we received the words of God. Now, there are also reflections of Adam and Eve's encounter with God in the Garden of Eden, but that's part of a different story. Just wanted to set a fuller stage for you for what's going on. So as we personally encounter the scroll, the Sefer Torah, as we each one as individuals encounter it, we show our respect by touching it with tzitzit or siddur, and we show our commitment to respond by doing it the same way. And you see it in front of you when we read from the scroll. The reader and those who assist with the scroll, you'll see, will touch their tzitzit traditionally to the beginning of the text that's being read, and then after the text is read, to the end of the text that's read. Again, sign of respect and response. And since it's at the beginning and the end of the text, it's almost as if it's saying, I intend to follow the whole of what's being read here. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the long story of touching the tzitzit to the Torah. I said the question was going to be short to share with you, but it's going to take longer to respond to. All right. Then there was I was going to say a question that was sent in to us.
A magnum opus.
Yes. And that's the length of the question that was sent in. And it's not a question, it's a very involved question, and there are a number of elements in this, and it would take probably a couple hours to answer it all. But let me set the stage for it. It has to do largely with how does Messianic Judaism relate to the Christian church, and how does it relate to the rest of Judaism? By relate to, I don't mean in a relational fashion of interactions with, but in a more, for lack of a better term, we'll put it, theological and
Or philosophical.
or philosophical or historical
agreement.
Yeah.
Or they can be both at the same time. You can have a philosophical and a theological.
Yes.
Also going in there are worldview ideas.
Yo, didn't even think about that. Yes, definitely.
So there's also worldview ideas. Your worldview, it's very hard to describe in less than 10 minutes. Your worldview is what you bring to trying to understand things. So when you are reading a book, your worldview is everything that you have learned and know to be true. And you bring that with you and you read a book, and you can only interpret what's in the book based on your own worldview. It's incredibly rare people who have more than one or can shift back and forth from one worldview to the other. So if I say that there's a Christian worldview and there's a Jewish worldview, then you can see part of what the difficulty is. Western people who live in countries of the West, we have a common worldview. Individuals can have they have little tweaks in certain areas. But for Jewish people who have a Jewish worldview, it's going to be way different when they interpret statements and when they interpret talks or sermons or lectures. They're going to bring a different set of truths with them than Christians bring with them. And that's sort of very simplistic way to understand what your worldview is, but it does matter as far as interpretation of anything. We were talking about Mel Gibson's movie, so this is an example. And one of the issues that we needed to get across in that book was when Christians went to watch Mel Gibson's film, they brought with them their Christian worldview. And they saw certain things, and they saw certain things were important, and they saw certain things that they agreed with, and they saw certain things they'd never thought about before. Jewish people would go to see the same film, and what they would key in on are totally different things. It's like they don't watch the same movie because they see something and they can only interpret it through their own worldview. And the Jewish worldview is very much different than the Christian worldview in Western nations. I'll just leave that there.
Right, I'm going to expand it just a little bit. Patrice referred to it briefly. In the Western world, basically we are heirs to what is called the Hellenistic worldview. The biblical texts and the biblical people grew up in what was called a Near Eastern worldview. And there are some significant differences, and some of you who've been with us in some of our classes, we take a lot of time spelling out the differences between the two worldviews. Now, by and large, both Jews and non-Jews in the Western world are impacted by the Hellenist worldview, and so are somewhat removed from the Near Eastern worldview, which is the worldview of the ancient sages and certainly of the biblical texts. But the Jewish worldview has been impacted more directly by the ancient Near Eastern worldview from which it grew up. So there is some mix in the Jewish worldview, but there's some, as Patrice mentioned, the way in which Jewish people look at things because of our culture and our heritage and our worldview is going to be different from the way in which non-Jews do so. So that's all part of this particular package. Then there's, as part of the package, there's what has happened in history between the development of Christianity and the development of Judaism. That history has not been a very, how should we put it, positive or pleasant history for most of the interactions between these two groups.
In general, I'm going to say, and
Yeah,
I think this will help everybody. In general, when you go to a synagogue and on a regular basis and you participate and you have a bar bat mitzvah and you grow up in a Jewish family in a Jewish synagogue, you're going to spend hours and hours and hours about the history of the Jewish people. You're going to have a full-blown giant course in understanding why Jews developed the way they developed. In Christian churches, you do not get the history of the Christian church, do you? Ever. There's no Bible studies on it. There's no talking about it. There's a big, giant blank. So that would be a good example of how a Jewish worldview would differ from a Christian worldview. So if your average Christian in America were to be quizzed on just basics of church history, they'd be going like this: I don't know. I don't know. Isn't that Catholic? If it's Catholic, I don't know anything about it. Double. So that's part of that gap. Jewish people are extremely aware by the time they're adults of their own history. And they're extremely aware of the interaction of Jewish people with Christians down through the centuries. They know a lot of stuff. If you ask Christians if they knew anything about Christian interaction with Jewish people down through the centuries, they would be, no, don't know. Well, Jesus is important, so that's all we need to know. So it's a whole different worldview. History is important or history is not important. Yeah.
Okay, now, to further complicate the issue of how do Messianic Jews and our Messianic communities, or how should, relate to Christianity, relate to Judaism, all interrelate, is further complicated by something that Patrice and I have had extensive experience in, and that is, as she just referenced a minute or so ago, when you talk about Christianity, what exactly are you talking about?
Which one?
Are you talking about, I'm going to start with something that's absolutely current now. Are you talking about the Orthodox Church? For example, the Orthodox Church in the Ukraine.
Or Greek Orthodox?
Well, if you're talking about the Orthodox Church in the Ukraine, there are two Orthodox churches in the Ukraine. There is one that's
The Russian Orthodox.
the one that
Church.
is the Russian Orthodox Church, and the one is more closely connected to the Greek Orthodox Church. And then in Ukraine also, you have Ukrainian Catholics who differ from the Orthodox, who differ from the other Orthodox. So which group are you talking about? And we haven't even gotten into the world of Protestantism yet.
Yeah, you're saying, well, what about the Protestants in Ukraine? Yeah, they don't. You could count them on one hand. They would be missionary groups.
Okay, so now in the world of Christianity, we move also in, like I said, mentioned the Catholic Church, you move into the world of the Protestant Church. In the world of the Protestant Church, boy, you find all kinds of things. You have, just to name a few, you've got Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans and, oh, and speaking of Baptists, you probably have about 6 different kinds of Baptists.
Half of whom do not speak to the other half.
And among Lutherans, you have 3 or 4 different kinds of Lutherans who often don't interact with one another either.
They don't speak to each other either. They have that means they have different seminaries that they send their people to. They don't have fellowship. They don't get together and have a party. They don't speak to each other.
And then you have Presbyterians who are at war with other Presbyterians because they're different denominations of Presbyterians. Oh, and then there are the Methodists.
They can't get along with anybody.
You got the United Methodists and the Free Methodists and who knows, the Wesleyan Methodists. And, you know, you go on and on and on and on. Oh, by the way, speaking of Baptists, and I love this, we encountered some, you've heard of Seventh-day Adventists, perhaps. You've got them out there as well.
And they're a whole different.
There's a group called Seventh-day Baptists. And when we encountered them in Chicago, the Seventh-day Baptists, are we ready for this? Come full circle? Were Ukrainian Baptists. So,
Yeah, the Seventh-day Baptists are great because, boy, are they understanding about why everybody should have Shabbat on Saturday rather than Sunday. They're very powerful on that topic. And I'm just standing there basically going like this. Okay, so.
and by the way, we're familiar with them not just conceptually. We've actually spoken in a number of their churches and interacted with them, and we've had a number of their representatives in the seminary and yeshiva.
Yeah, you don't have to be Ukrainian to be Seventh-day Baptist.
No.
I met some in seminary. They were from basically Wisconsin. But when they don't have chats with other Baptists either, because other Baptists are going, you're wrong. Because the Sabbath was changed to Sunday. Everybody knows that. It's in the Bible. And then the Seventh-day Baptists would go, please find the verse. That's what I liked about them.
All right. And we haven't even mentioned Episcopalians, who are also at war with other
They don't speak to
Episcopalians.
each other either.
Sometimes they're called Anglicans. And some of them sound an awful lot like Catholics. That's because they broke off from the Catholic Church
Well,
at a different time and space.
in the book, The Distortion, I actually wrote a little paragraph about this problem, which is, it's Christianity. Yeah, but half the people don't speak to the other half. They don't have anything to do with them because they're wrong. Those other people are wrong, and we're the only ones who are correct. And I said, right, I didn't say it this way, but I'm going to make it more user-friendly. So we have a Target right up the road here. And if you stood by the door and you asked the next 100 people who walked into Target, so an average people walking into Target, average, not trying to sort them out, and go, what's the difference between Catholics and Protestants? Half of them are going to say, I don't know. Some of the Catholics are going to say the Protestants are wrong. Some of the Protestants are going to say the Catholics are wrong. But that's all they know. That's all. That's it. That's their topic. That's what the answer is. I don't know, but the other ones are wrong. So this is an education problem in your worldview. And that also means that, can you blame Jewish people when they don't know the difference between Protestant and Catholic? They just don't know. John and I have seen, I'm going to say a dozen. So in the past 10 years, we've seen about a dozen TV shows where it's talking about this fundamentalist Protestant church, and then on the wall, there would be a cross with Yeshua hanging on it. So they can't get it right because the people who wrote it and produced it don't know that would never happen. That would never happen if they were fundamentalist Baptists. You were not going to see a crucifix. So you can please forgive Jewish people if they can't get it straight. They don't know Catholics and Protestants are two worlds that don't really communicate too well with each other at all, much less the mixtures of Protestants.
Now, then on top of all that, in Judaism, we have not just one branch of Judaism, but several branches of Judaism. You've got Reform Judaism, which is the largest group now in the United States, not far behind it numbers-wise, is Conservative Judaism. It has nothing to do with politics. By the way, you've got Orthodox Judaism. You have, in certain parts of this country, something called Traditional Judaism. That falls between Orthodox and Conservative. You've got Reconstructionist Judaism. You've got Universalistic Judaism. You got Humanistic Judaism. You got various branches out there. The major ones tend to be the first ones I mentioned. Then you have a subgrouping of the Orthodox, who are the ultra-Orthodox. And among the ultra-Orthodox, there's probably a couple dozen different branches or sects of that. The most familiar one is the one Chabad, because Chabad happens to be very outreach-oriented. So when you're talking about interactions of these groups, there are all kinds of variations. Now all of that, took a lot of time to say all that, but all of that sets the stage in the background for what the nature of this question or series of questions is all about. So how do they interrelate? How should they interrelate? And I'm going to try to refrain from naming names, specific names, not of groups, but of individual
People.
congregations or people, yes, or organizations as we go through this.
So John and I have been around the Messianic movement for about 47 years. And we still don't know every person. We never knew who the original group of us was. So please do not think that if you happen to talk to somebody that we, of course, know what branch of Messianic Judaism they come from. But on the other hand, we might know what area they come from and what they tend to believe. But we try to keep a peace kept up more than I have because he's been on more mailing lists where different people are reached out to.
And within Messianic Judaism, you also have groups and variations. For most of this discussion, I want to speak mainly from within the perspective of those congregations who are associated with the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. I'm going to do so because our synagogue is part of that particular organization.
And there are other organizations, and we have friends in these other organizations, but they do not agree with what the union is doing as a congregation.
All right. Now, another reason for choosing the union perspective in this case is because for many, many years, the union was considered a large tent organization. Groups within it could belong to it, but not necessarily be in complete agreement with each other, so long as they were in agreement with the larger perspective of the union.
Stop me if I'm wrong, but it has never been part of the union's way of belonging as a congregation that we would sign our name on a statement of faith. That does not happen. If you are thrilled that some people sign their name to a statement of faith and then you read the statement of faith and you get a feeling for what exactly it is they believe, then you'll be disappointed with the way the union operates.
Basically, to be part of the union, you have to, in addition to going through the membership process and to interact with people who are in the union, just to, so you know this is where you want to be. You have to, on a yearly basis, agree to that you are still in agreement with the union core values and with the defining Messianic Judaism statement. And apart from that, there are all kinds of variations. Now, I said we had been known as a big tent. More recently, those of us who sit in the executive committee of the union have begun to describe it as a patchwork.
A quilt?
A quilt. Mm-hmm. Would you describe what a quilt is?
Well, if you think of it in literal terms, so it's a giant, a blanket that's made up of little squares. And the squares are all, many of them are different, but they're in different patterns. So the squares are not, it's not one big pink blanket. That would be the opposite of a quilt. A quilt is a pattern of squares that work together where each of the pieces of a pattern has its own colors and flowers and birds and everything. But overall, when you step back from the blanket, the little patches become part of an integrated whole. Is that fair enough?
You catch that? The patches are different from each other.
They're different colors, different patterns. Some are stripy, some are flowers, some are spots. But they go together in a pattern.
That's a good way of describing what the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations is. Now, if you understand that, as well as the rest of what we've talked about,
you're basically insane now. So
now you've got the setting for the question and why it has even come up, or the questions, or some of these were observations, some of these were concerns. I might add another dimension to this. None of these groups are the same as they were 100 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, or since we're going back to the beginnings of what we would call the Messianic movement 2,000 years ago. There's been historical development taking place. Yet in relationship to one another, particularly in recent years, there has been a lot of conversation and a lot of stronger relationships between the various religious groups that we would often call Christian and Jewish, as they try to atone for sins past and as well as make up for problems.
By that you mean as far as Jewish Gentile
Jewish Christian
relations.
relation, yeah. So, and particularly among Christian denominations as well as Protestants and Catholicism, there's been in the last, say, 50 years, there's been a growing understanding on the parts of those movements of the importance of the Jewish backgrounds and origins of their faith, as well as their relationship to the Jewish people and to Judaism in general. And that has all been moving in a very positive direction, both in the sense of awareness and in the sense of relationship. Okay, now, that means that anything we say at one point in time about the interrelationship of these groups is going to be different at another point in time and may very well be different in 3 months. Fair enough? Now, the starting point for a lot of the discussion in this particular interrelated series of questions and concerns has to do with the olive tree.
Symbolism of the olive tree.
And by the way, there's an excellent book that's out of print that was in fact cited by the questioners called The Olive Tree Connection.
And if you want it, you can go on any used book site on the interwebs, and I'm sure you'll find many copies, like for $1 a piece. Sometimes the postage is more expensive than the book.
Yeah, and the author would be happy to sign a copy if you get a copy, and you're looking at the author. But anyhow,
I made up the title.
Yes, she's the author of the title.
I'm good at titles.
Olive Tree Connection. It comes from Romans chapter 11. And in Romans chapter 11, and again, the questioners point this out, talks about the olive tree. The olive tree in Romans chapter 11 has to do with the Jewish people. And when you talk about the Jewish people, you're also talking about the Jewish faith. If you want to call it religion, that's fine as well. But that's what we're talking about. And the tree has definitely in that text has Jewish roots. And as we draw it out in a couple of the classes, the trunk of the tree is Jewish as well. And there are some natural branches that are part of this natural olive tree. We should call it probably cultivated olive tree to be more precise.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. It's not a wild olive
It's not a
tree,
wild tree.
which you can find, but it's a cultivated.
Cultivated olive tree. And so it has its own branches. And in that image, it has branches that have been taken from a wild olive tree and grafted into this, in the use of the terminology in Romans 11, into the natural olive tree. In other words, people from elsewhere have been brought into this. And then the rabbi there in Romans 11 says, don't boast against the roots or, in fact, the trunk, because you're just branches who've been grafted in if you're not Jewish. Now, part of the concern that's reflected in this question, in the series of questions, has to do with the fact that as you look at things today in the Messianic Jewish world, certainly in the broader Messianic Jewish world, but also parts of this patchwork called the Union, it sometimes appears as if the Jewish branches, in this case, the Messianic Jewish branches, have been grafted into a Christian tree. In that it seems that some of the thinking, the teaching, for lack of a better term, the theology seems to have been derived from outside of Judaism, rather than looking at, rather than what taking place is that the Christian denominations are taking their teaching and their thinking from the Jewish tree into which they're supposedly grafted.
I would say that when we first became involved in the modern Messianic movement, so that's the part of the historical timeline that started in the early 1970s. So that's the one we're familiar with. there were Messianic Jewish congregations that were in the 1800s. They were not in America, but they existed. And so at certain times down through history, there have been the concept of Jewish believers in Yeshua coming together as a congregation on their own. But the movement that started in the early 1970s, which is the one we were a part of, I would say that 80 to 90% of us were Jewish people who have been discipled in Christian churches or by Christians. And so we found a tremendous lack of background in the Jewish worldview, in Jewish stuff. Most of the Messianic Jews got their ideas about Judaism from Christians. There were very, very few people who were raised in a Jewish home who entered into Messianism. There were some, but in general, a lot of Christian discipleship, which means you're not getting a lot of Judaism. You're getting some Judaism, you're getting approved Judaism, because there's certain parts of Judaism that are approved by the Christian world, but there's a whole pile of the Jewish world that's not approved by the Christian world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the historical background for this current version of the Messianic Messianic Judaism. Now, what has happened more recently is that strong currents, both in Protestant and in Catholic worlds, as I suggested earlier, have begun to realize importance of learning more about their Jewish roots. And in fact, there is a movement that is somewhat fringe called the Hebraic Roots Movement. And I don't want to get involved in that, in talking about it, but it's, how can I describe it briefly? It basically says, when you probe it deep enough, that everything Jewish is good and everything Christian is not. And therefore, Christians should be doing only Jewish things and not anything else. So it's actually gone that far in swinging back. Now, where was I going to go with that? In the case of the building we're sitting in, we happen to be sitting in the Bayside room of the synagogue, but we're also happen to be sitting in the classroom of St. Petersburg Seminary and Yeshiva. A brief history of the seminary because it relates to this. It started out as a Baptist seminary. Very quickly, very early on, dropped the Baptist from the seminary because it wanted to be, and we coined the term, not non-denominational, trans-denominational. And from the outset of this seminary, even when it started as a Baptist seminary, one of the core values of the seminary when it started was that if you're going to understand these texts of the Bible correctly, they are texts written by Jews for Jews or to Jews. So you need to know something about Judaism if you're going to understand the text, the authors, and the readers. So from the outset, the seminary required courses in Judaic studies to be part of any seminary student's background going forward. And I'm going to really short circuit the history on this because there are a couple other developing points along the way. The most recent development was, and it occurred, the conversation actually occurred in this very room after the seminary sold its property down in St. Pete to move into this building because it was more central. Sitting in that very table in the back was the cabinet of St. Petersburg Theological Seminary. And I happened to be in the cabinet at that time, and one of our cabinet members said, I've been thinking a lot about this recently. He said, I think we got things upside down or backwards. Since as I read the scriptures, and he was reflecting now in Romans 9 to 11. Christianity should have been a branch of Judaism. Judaism is not a branch of Christianity. And here at the seminary, we've got it backwards. We've got our Jewish studies as sort of a branch of the seminary. The seminary, in fact, should not be a seminary, but a yeshiva, and the Christian stuff should be taught from within a Jewish perspective. It already was being done that, but he was now talking organization. And everyone around the table, after they listened to him speak, said, you know, you're right. So they said, why don't we make a seminary a part of the yeshiva instead of the yeshiva a part of the seminary? Well, after some discussion, it was decided that we would call it St. Petersburg Seminary and Yeshiva, for any one of a number of reasons. But that reality was understood. And so, at least in the seminary and yeshiva, that has become not only the logic, but the optics of the seminary and yeshiva. All right. Now, what does that look like on the ground? It's some details that are mentioned in this series of questions. Oh, one other thing I need to say by way of background. How is Messianic Judaism viewed in the larger Christian world? How is Messianic Judaism viewed in the larger Jewish world? There are some parts of Christianity that look with favor on Messianic Judaism because of their attraction to and now reacquaintance with some things Jewish. But there are parts of the Christian world that still think Messianic Judaism is all wrong. Because if you become a believer in Jesus, then you ought to be a follower of Jesus, who is the Christ, and therefore you should be a Christian. There's still some people who say that and say, therefore, Messianic Judaism is wrong. Now, there are parts of Judaism that think Messianic Judaism is not Judaism at all. But there are increasingly larger parts of Judaism that do view Messianic Judaism as Jewish. I'm going to give you just two examples and I've got books by these authors right through those doors. A number of years ago, a Reformed rabbi, scholar, professor, was teaching at the University of Wales, Rabbi Daniel Cohen Sherbach, wrote a book called Messianic Judaism, in which he argues that Messianic Judaism is and should be understood as one of the branches of Judaism. And he not only wrote the book, he has argued on our behalf publicly in various settings. And in fact, even was a main speaker at one of our union conferences a number of years ago. There's another book I have in there by, I believe the author's name is Shapiro, who also argues in favor of Messianic Judaism. Now, Daniel Cohen Sherbach was familiar with people like us in the Union. This Rabbi Shapiro was not familiar with people in the Union, but was familiar with some of these other Messianic congregations that were non-Union congregations, which tended to be less traditionally oriented than we are.
They're a little wacky. That's your technical term, a little bit wacky.
I wasn't going to use that term, and with regard to a less traditional form of Messianic Judaism, that rabbi argued that those people also are part of Judaism, and that Messianic Judaism, that's all that the rabbi was aware of at the time, should be considered Judaism. So there's a broader acceptance. And this acceptance has gone, it's not just been here in the United States, but in Israel as well. If you do some surveys of Jewish people in Israel, if I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, I think somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2, if not more, of the Jewish people in Israel think Messianic Judaism is okay, is Judaism. And again, I remind you that they are aware of not just the quilt that is the Union, but an even broader perspective of Messianic Judaism. Another example is just a couple of years ago, a major Jewish scholar who teaches at Duke Amy Jill Levine was one of our featured speakers at our union conference. And she was also a featured speaker at another conference we were part of the month before COVID. That's how I remember it. So that kind of acceptance or growing acceptance is there. There are still many in the Jewish community who want no part of us. Now, there are also parts of the Jewish community, and I'm reminded of a statement that came out just a handful of years ago. It was very similar to a statement that came out at the beginning of the 21st century, where a number of rabbis, well over 100 rabbis, signed a statement that said that they feel that, not Messianic Jews, but that Christianity is a monotheistic religion, and that it's an acceptable religion as far as Judaism is concerned. First version of that came out in the early 2000s. A more recent one came out about half a dozen years ago. So this is signed on, like I said, by a number of important rabbis here in the United States, maybe United States and Canada. So you have all of that going on as part of the background. So you're going to find individual differences and variations, some of which you'll be comfortable with, some of which you will not be comfortable with in various places. And you're going to find them here in this synagogue as well, and in this seminary and yeshiva as well. The reason I brought up,
I'm just pointing
yeah, I
out
know.
time.
The reason I brought up that last statement was one of the things that is often problematic is what's often called Trinitarianism, or the concept of the Trinity. If you join me in the class that I'm scheduled to teach next year at this time, Messianic Apologetics, at the end of that particular class, I will spend probably 2.5 or 3 hours discussing the deity of the Messiah from the Jewish sources. I did a shorter version of that, I believe, at the end of the Roots class. Barbara checked me on this last year at this time. So this concept of what is often called Trinity or Trinitarianism, which is often said as a dividing line between these two groups, can be shown to come from Jewish sources. And by Jewish sources, I'm not just talking about the Older Testament or the Newer Testament. I'm talking about the rabbinic material as well. We may not call it Trinity. We might call it, as some suggested, the triunity or the unique unity of the Godhead, or of God. There are all kinds of various ways to describe this. But that does not, at its heart, does not derive from Messianic Judaism being grafted into a Christian tree, but if you push it back historically, it derives directly from Judaism and Judaism's understanding, certainly back into the Second Temple period, of the nature of God. Interestingly enough, and this just popped in my head, a later version of Judaism, post-Second Temple period, called mystical Judaism, of which the Kabbalah is the central text. In the Zohar, or the Kabbalistic texts are central, in the Zohar, which is a central text, the Zohar itself reflects on the fact, and I would love to quote this for you, but I'll butcher it if I try to quote it. The Zohar, oh, by the way, it is in the olive tree connection, in the appendix. The Zohar speaks of the threefold nature of God. Prior to Yeshua, the Jewish philosopher Philo talks about the threefold nature of God. He's a Jewish philosopher. So that's why I say when we're talking about Jewish sources for this thing. So a lot of the things that are in Christianity do actually come historically from Jewish sources, even though they have now been in some cases skewed, hyper-developed, or adapted, or whatever.
Are we answering any of these?
Yes,
questions? We are?
yeah.
Okay.
So, what should Messianic Judaism look like? Messianic Judaism should look like, what we would like to say, much like what we have here in this synagogue.
That's our truth, and we're sticking to it.
Yeah, it should be tradition. Yeah, based on the traditions. It should be based on the Jewish texts. and the Newer Testament is a Jewish text. And it should be based on a Jewish understanding of those texts, which, as we reflected on before, there can be some anti-Semitic sounding interpretations or understanding of the text, but if you peel the text back, you'll find that they are not. As these movements developed, and in a couple of classes, since you mentioned the board, let me do this on the board.
Okay, so I'm not sure that it's doable right now, because it was doable
Can this be seen?
maybe if they have the screen blown up so you can see.
All right, people on the monitor, can you see what I just drew up here? Yes. Okay, this is my version of a funnel. In the time of the late Second Temple period, there were some better than 24, I'd say 24 plus groups of Judaism. With the destruction of the temple, of these groups, only two surfaced or survived. One was Messianic Judaism. One became known as classical or rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism has its roots back in the Second Temple period, just like Messianic Judaism. Now, Messianic Judaism continued until, in a visible way, at least until the 7th century. Rabbinic Judaism continued down through the ages and eventually broke into these various branches we talked about. Messianic Judaism sort of faded into the woodwork and then reemerged in the early 70s. Not until around the 4th century do you get a veering off of what we would call the larger Messianic Jewish movement into what was institutionalized Christianity. Okay? All of these groups developed down through the ages. And even prior to this split off of historical Christianity or institutionalized Christianity, there were some developments that helped lead to this. But it did not take place formally until the church councils of the 4th century. Okay, now we can come back. Okay, so that's how all this developed. In those early ages, there were some people that were involved in some truly anti-Semitic stuff. Chrysostom comes to mind right away from the 4th century. Later on, there were some other strongly anti-Semitic things that developed. It was in the church councils that you began to get some anti-Jewish pushback theologically. But remember, the church councils were 4th century. Some of the early church fathers had their problems as well, but the movement as a whole, what you would call historic Christianity, that did not become institutionalized until the time of the church councils. In fact, in the 2nd century, early 2nd century, some people put it at the end of the 1st century, you have something called the Didache, supposedly the teaching of the 12 apostles. It's too late to be the teaching of the 12 apostles directly because they were dead by that time. But they're supposed to be based on the teaching of the 12 apostles. This was a formative document within the 2nd century and beyond what we would call early church. If you read the Didache, it looks and sounds very Jewish. So that is all part of how all this developed historically. So we can see, and along with that came, oh, you shouldn't be observing Passover.
Why would you want to?
Or why would you want to? Although
It's always couched in well, that's passé, and now you're not under the law, you're under grace. So why would you want to do all those rituals?
Although I will say Jerome, but in Jerome, we're at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th. I think it's Jerome writing to Augustine rather than the other way around. I think it's Jerome who says, if you don't celebrate the Passover, you're a heretic, which is rather striking. But again, as this thing became institutionalized, the Jewish stuff was set aside on the shelf, to be put away. Again, some of it has roots earlier on, but it doesn't become institutionalized till then. All right, down through the years, there was some great hostility between the church and Judaism. Early Judaism, as it developed, back up here. In that time period, it's not really early, it's Second Temple Judaism, actually post-Second Temple Judaism. This is the year 70, by the way.
Where's the year 7?
This line that
Where the funnel starts?
where the funnel, that's
Comes
only,
in there.
yeah, okay. This Judaism, as it developed and as it was formulated by the early rabbis of the Talmudic period and the pre-Talmudic period, was not formulated in response to this break-off called Christianity, nor was it formulated in response to what we call Messianic Judaism. And in fact, if you look at the early Jewish materials, you will find it doesn't say virtually anything at all about Christianity. So Judaism developed not in opposition to Christianity. Christianity, at least in its early stages, did not develop in opposition to Judaism. That only began to creep in later stages. Right? So all of that needs to inform the discussion and some of the observations that come out of this very deeply thought out series of concerns and questions. So Judaism back in the earlier days of classical Judaism, Judaism to this day was not and is not formulated in response either to Christianity or to Messianic Judaism. By and large, Judaism has ignored that down through the years. So it's not as if the larger Jewish community spends all its time in opposition to Messianic Judaism. Those parts of Judaism who are not okay or not tolerant of Messianic Judaism, by and large, ignore Messianic Judaism, and they just develop their own thinking and approach. I'm trying to pick up Bixen.
Yeah, I wouldn't try to.
I just want to. I think, largely speaking, most of this we've dealt with. The persons who ask these questions, feel free to send us in follow-up questions or stuff we may not have actually covered in this very broad kind of perspective as to where Messianic Judaism fits, should fit in relationship to Christianity, in relationship to Judaism. And again, let me end on a positive note. The positive note is reflected by what is happening in the larger church movements about a greater openness to Jewish, I don't want to use the term roots, but to their Jewish backgrounds and to a closer connection with Jewish people. And the Catholic Church going back to the 60s has been very much at the forefront of this.
Yeah, the Catholic Church does better at acknowledging Judaism, believe it or not. They're publishing that their scholars write more approvingly about Judaism, are more knowledgeable about Judaism. That does not mean that has trickled down to the average Catholic on the street by any means. It's just saying that Protestants really are behind on appreciating the Jewish explanations for many, many things. And it doesn't even occur to them. Old Testament people who are Christians they almost never look at Jewish sources. They almost never look at any Talmudic anything. They never read anybody Jewish who's written, even on historical stuff. I don't think it occurs to them that this would be a good idea. Because if there's one thing we should be able to agree on is the activity in the Older Testament. That would seem to be common ground. And yet it's not really, as far as Protestantism is concerned. It's more or less, yeah, we don't want to get into that stuff, is what the Protestants say. And I find that's willful ignorance. Maybe they're afraid that they're going to learn some things that will not be approved. I don't know.
So, positive note. A greater openness to Jews, to Judaism, to, on the part of Christianity, and on their greater openness to their Jewish foundations. On the part of Judaism, there is a greater openness, and I'm going to say increasing openness, to us as Messianic Jews. For example, those, and I've got two other books by different rabbis or Jewish scholars who are writing in favor of Messianic Judaism. You've got that taking place as well.
Are you done with that?
No, not quite.
Okay, go ahead.
So all of that's positive. I think there's another positive thing going on, and that is within Messianic Judaism. And we've seen this within the quilt of the Union. There's been, let me set the stage for that. We started the synagogue at the request of Dr. David Bronstein. His request was to start a Messianic synagogue that is authentically Jewish. That was his terminology. In other words, it could be seen, it can be felt. The optics and the experience were Jewish. We've seen more of that developing within the Union. We have tried to develop that as strongly as possible here within the synagogue. Authentic Judaism, the standard for authentic Judaism, and this is the last thing I wanted to say, the standard for authentic Judaism is not Orthodox Judaism. I know Orthodox Jews think that they are the standard for Judaism. It is not either historically or conceptually, I would argue. So,
In other words, we shouldn't all want to strive to be Orthodox Jews.
Yeah.
That would be a mistake. That wouldn't be where we should be looking to prove that we're the most Jewish people we can possibly be. And yet there are many in the Messianic movement who still subconsciously feel that way.
yes, and that's the reason I mentioned that. We have nothing against Orthodox Judaism.
No.
Some of my favorite cousins are Orthodox Jews. Thank you, Barbara. I can always count on a smile coming from you over these lousy jokes.
And they're the ones who bring their own paper plates to the family gatherings.
Mhm.
So they shouldn't eat off the plates of the family.
But as much as I love them, as much as they've done for Judaism, they're not the standard. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to give a little example,
Please.
in my way. So, I was just going to say just a few years ago, but actually it's more like 20 years ago. But it's about our daughter. So we sent both of our kids to public schools, proudly so. And we would do it again in a heartbeat. Our daughter in middle school was chosen to be in a special science-oriented middle school program where middle school kids from all around Pinellas County came to that program, and they tested at a certain level. And so they were all the smart kids who were interested in science and in a specific way of teaching. And it was the first time in middle school that she really encountered more than one Jewish person. She encountered, dozens of Jewish people in the program in middle school. And it was an experience for her. And she didn't say much. There was only, when she went through her bat mitzvah, one of her so-called friends started making snotty remarks about it's not really Jewish, she's not really Jewish. And the other ones of her friends says, shut up, you don't even know what you're talking about, to the one fair weather friend. But here's what happened. So one Friday night, we see a girl about her age show up with a notebook in her arm. This is a middle schooler. She's one of these smart kids. And she said, I'm interested because my family told me that Messianic Jews are not Jews. So I just wanted to see for myself what you do here at your congregation. And I don't think our daughter was there that night. I think she had a dance thing that she was in. I don't remember her interacting. Let's call her Rachel. So Rachel came to check us out. And so this is me in the pews. Oh, dear Lord, please help us. Help Rachel. And her response, which Eve did talk to her about her response afterwards, she goes, it was just like my synagogue service. It was just as Jewish as my synagogue service is. And so that's the remarks of a young person who came to see if we were really Jewish because she'd been prejudiced against us. And granted, she was only 13 or 14 years old, but she was smart enough to see they're doing the same things we in my synagogue. And so if that gives you any hope, and it continually gives me hope, that when Jewish people who are not familiar with Messianic Judaism, they may have positive or negative thoughts, but when they come to see a service like ours, they identify it as Jewish.
Reminded me of another incident. One of our earlier members, he's graduated now to higher callings.
To the yeshiva in the
To
sky.
the yeshiva in the sky, as the rabbis say. He would bring occasionally his uncle with him to services. And his uncle, who was a conservative cantor, used to love to come to our services and to sing along with us. So that's the kind of thing that we believe Messianic Judaism ought to be. And the people who raised this question, we spent a lot of time on. That's where they're coming from as well, and that's what reflected their concerns also. But we wanted to address that in somewhat of a broad-based way. But we've more than over-addressed that because of the time. But that means it's now time to come full circle and to say it's time for beer and pizza, as the son has said.
If only we could pass out beer and pizza, everyone, but it's not within our capability right now.
Okay, before we shut it down, any questions on, well, we covered a whole lot of ground tonight. Any questions? Last minute questions?
Thank you.
If there are others that arise,
Everything.
if there are others that arise,
Yeah.
send them to stumpthestars at
Stump the stars
at gmail.com.
at gmail.com.
Barbara, you were going to say something?
Yes, I'm so thankful that the Lord has started removing the veil from the Jewish people, because the perspective that it gives on Scripture is just amazing, and it's so exciting. And I just love it. The depth is incredible. And just a ad for the yeshiva that you teach it's amazing. I share with my friends, and they're like, wow, where'd you get all that good stuff? I keep trying to get them to sign up
Yeah.
because it's very reasonable. It's not that expensive, and it's just wonderful. And the other comment I have is, thank God that there is one, and he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, because all of these branches and all this stuff is so confusing. And I'm like, thank you, Lord.
But the good thing is more and more they're getting along better. Okay,
Hopefully.
well, from what we can see. All right. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's quickly close in prayer, and then we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Some of you will see much sooner. Father, thank you for this time that we've been able to interact about some very important stuff. Thank you for those who raised the questions, those who have been part of our group right tonight than those who will join us either on YouTube or Vimeo later. We are grateful for this opportunity. We would ask that this stuff would not just be stuff talked about, but stuff that would sink into our lives in a way that attracts others, and that we will all walk more closely and hand in hand with you. The resurrected one, who was the Passover Lamb of God. Thank you. Oh, and love the Hogwarts t-shirt that is looking back at us.
You guys are dynamite.
Yep,
Thank you so
thank you.
much.
It was great as always.
Late out.
Hit the road.
Sorry, we stepped on what you were saying, Betty.
I said it was great as always. I learned so much at Stump the Stores.
Well, thank you, thank you.
Thanks. Because I always think, why would people want to listen to us go blah, blah, blah?